Welcome back to another quarter of Sabbath School Boot Camp, where my job is to help train Sabbath School teachers, front row students, to get the most out of their class. Today, we are going to be looking at Lesson 4 of the Adult Bible Study Guide. It is called Sharing God's Mission. So, grab your Bibles and your study guides because Sabbath School Boot Camp starts now. Welcome back to class. In this lesson, we're going to be studying Abraham, what it takes to be of service to God. Now, the lesson notes that Abraham was hospitable. He loved everybody. He was a man of prayer and was humble. These characteristics qualified him for God's mission. Now, I'm going to have a few things to say about that as we go, so let's get on with Sunday. On Sunday, we are talking about Abraham's hospitality and how he took care of 3 travelers he came across. Now, I'm sure Abraham was hospitable, but the chapter opens by saying that the Lord appeared to Abraham. So, whatever that means, Abraham immediately understood that these were no ordinary travelers. Abraham's hospitality is meant to stand in stark contrast to Sodom's lack of hospitality in the next chapter, where 2 angels show up in town and Lot welcomes them, much like Abraham does, but the rest of the city wants to rape them, apparently. Abraham and Lot show warm hospitality. Sodom is cold and cruel. That's the purpose of the story in Genesis 18. Now, personally, I think that Abraham embodied the ideal of hospitality in this story, which was expected in the ancient Near East. In Judges 19, we have that horrifying story, like Genesis 19, of a lack of hospitality in the judgment that follows. Deuteronomy 23 makes it clear that no Ammonite or Moabite is to be allowed into the community of Israel for 10 generations because they failed to give Israel water and bread when they were in the wilderness. We have to understand that hospitality was not just good manners. It was often a matter of survival back then. To refuse to take a traveler in might be seen as being indifferent to whether they lived or died. So, what exactly were the expectations of hospitality? One scholar, Victor Matthews, studied both the Bible and some other ancient documents to come up with 7 codes of conduct. And I'm not going to read all of them for you, but it's interesting that Matthews sees these hospitality laws as an act of turning a potential threat into an ally through hospitality. Back then, a stranger could be anybody, a scout for an enemy tribe, a spy, a powerful person in disguise, a murderer, who knows? But by offering someone shelter, food, and water for a time, you have an opportunity to win their favor. The stranger knows that if they refuse your offer of hospitality, they might offend the town and find themselves in trouble. So it was in both parties' interest to offer hospitality and to accept hospitality. Hebrews 13:2 reminds us, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it." It was wise not to ignore strangers, but to welcome them. Everyone in the ancient world needed more allies, and you never know when you would need to benefit from someone else's hospitality. On Monday, we are talking about Abraham's love for everybody. This lesson could be called Abraham the Hippie. We're talking, of course, about Abraham's intercession for Sodom. Those 3 strangers were on their way to destroy the city, and Abraham famously bargained with them to spare the city. Now let's start with the obvious. Abraham didn't live in Sodom. We don't know his precise reasons why, but it's a fair guess that he knew the reputation of the city and didn't want to associate with it. Abraham was a wealthy man. He could have been somebody in the city. There was also a place of business there. The city could have also been safer than living in tents in the fields. Abraham must have had compelling reasons to live, outside of Sodom. His nephew Lot first pitched his tent outside the city, just like his uncle Abraham, but then we find him living in the city. Now, Lot found reasons to move to Sodom. Why didn't Abraham? Well, Abraham's refusal to live in Sodom is likely linked to some disapproval of Sodom. When his visitors say, Sodom is wicked and we're going to destroy it, Abraham doesn't argue about that. He doesn't say, really? I had no idea. He doesn't say, you know what, they're not so bad once you get to know them. He accepts that they are wicked people. Abraham's concern isn't so much with the Sodomites as it is with what he thinks are the righteous people living there. So does Abraham love the Sodomites? I don't think that's what this story is about. He loves righteousness, and so he is concerned that God's judgment might harm the righteous people in Sodom if he just destroys the city as a whole. The lesson says, through his love, Abraham hoped to save all the people in these cities, but not only the righteous. But does he? I don't think that point is as clear as the lesson thinks that it is. One could argue that Abraham only cares about the righteous people in Sodom. One could also argue that Abraham does care about everyone, but that his negotiating tactic focuses on the righteous people in Sodom because that's the only leverage he has with God. Another reason you could say Abraham loves everybody is due to the fact that he doesn't ask God to help the righteous escape. If Abraham only cared about the righteous, then why doesn't he say, fine, Lord, burn the city, only get the righteous people out first? Abraham presumes that the righteous will remain in the city, and for their sake, the wicked shouldn't be destroyed. This, by the way, is the wheat and tares problem that Jesus brings up in Matthew chapter 13. The final judgment can only happen when there is a way to separate the righteous from the wicked. Abraham doesn't seem to think that there is a way to separate them, so the whole city should be shown mercy. Does that mean he loves all the Sodomites equally? I don't know. One thing is for sure, we have a lot of Christians today who want to see Sodom burn. We like to call out the sins of society, but how many of us are praying for our political leaders? How many of us are praying for people in Hollywood? If we were in Abraham's shoes, would we have interceded for Sodom? And I ask that because it's really about who are you interceding for now? Let's move on to Tuesday and talk about Abraham's negotiation with God to spare Sodom. Notice how Abraham negotiates with God. It's not based on some external sense of right and wrong, like, I don't think this would be right. He negotiates with God on the basis of God's own character. Abraham tells God, far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked. In other words, it doesn't sound like you to destroy the righteous and the wicked. It's not who you are. This is why Jesus is best qualified to be our intercessor. You need someone who understands the difficulty of being human, as well as somebody who understands who God is. The standard for right and wrong is the character of God, which is partially expressed in his moral laws. Sometimes we say things like, God's law never changes. And while that's true in some sense, here is Abraham bargaining with God, seemingly getting a concession out of God. And I think God wants to be negotiated with in good faith. I think he wants us to wrestle with him. My friend Matthew Cortman wrote in a book, Saying No to God, where he argues that sometimes God asks us to do something that appears to be wrong in order to see how well we know him. He tells Abraham, go kill your son Isaac, to see, does he know that I'm not the God who would ask humans to do that? It's a teaching method to see if the student really understands the material. Teacher might say the wrong thing like, so class, 2 + 2 = 10, right? To see if his or her students will say, no, it equals 4, right? It equals 4, right? Okay. Anyways, she doesn't want her students to blindly follow whatever it is she says. She's testing them. So why does God stop by Abraham's tent that day? Because he wanted to be negotiated with. He knew Abraham. He knew Abraham would intercede for Sodom. God wanted the negotiation. As long as you do it in faith, I think God welcomes us pushing back. What might have happened if Abraham hadn't pushed back? If he would have said, oh, well, God is always right, so it's not my job to question. It's not my job to ask him for things. It's, okay, Lord, if you want to kill Sodom, go right ahead. That's not the kind of faith God wanted from Abraham. Well, how might things go differently for us if we persevere in prayer with God? God doesn't want blind obedience. He wants people who know him, who can reason with him from their knowledge of him. Let's move to Wednesday and talk about Abraham's mission, which isn't really Abraham's mission at all. This is God's mission to Sodom. The lesson asks, what was the result of Abraham's spirit of hospitality, love, and prayer? I don't know what Abraham's hospitality, love, and prayer did anything in this story. It was God's mission. It was God who rescued Lot and his family. Abraham didn't even ask God to spare his nephew by name. Delete chapter 18, and chapter 19 would have gone the same way. I'm not trying to take anything away from Abraham. I'm just saying, let's not pretend that this story is about his mission or his good qualities. God is the main character, and it's not clear whether Abraham's efforts in chapter 18 actually made a difference whatsoever. Now, Lot's hospitality was crucial. If he hadn't invited those angels inside, this would have gone very differently for him and his family. This is why in Hebrews 13:2 we're told to be hospitable, because some have entertained angels without knowing it. I've mentioned that before. Disney's Beauty and the Beast is all about how an act of inhospitality can have significant implications. The Sodom story is how an act of hospitality can have significant implications. You can never know when an act of kindness, mercy, or love can end up being decisive as a turning point in your life. Finally, Thursday. The emphasis here is on Abraham's obedience to God. In chapter 12, Abraham left Haran and traveled to Canaan even though he was 75 years old. That might sound relatively old to keep moving, but just keep in mind that Abraham was born when his father was at least 70, and his father lived to be 205. Abraham would live another 100 years, so he wasn't even middle-aged yet. For me, the main story here isn't just Abraham's obedience, but his faith. He completely placed his life in God's hands. He didn't know where God was leading him. When he got there in Canaan, there's a famine, and he had to keep going to Egypt. He had to trust that God wasn't going to let him down, even though they just passed the promised land. And I'm not trying to minimize Abraham's obedience here, only to point out that faith is what leads to true obedience. Without trust in God, Abraham had no reason to obey. So as impressive as Abraham's obedience is, his faith is more impressive. Okay, Friday time. This lesson was about these qualities Abraham had that qualified him for God's mission. And as I said at a few points, I don't think these qualities really made any difference in the story of Sodom. Though, of course, they are great qualities to have. The reason why I think the lesson whiffed this week is not that it's just wrong about everything, but just that it made Abraham the central character in the Sodom story when God is the central character in the Sodom story. It was God's love that spared Lot, not Abraham's. It was God's intercession that saved Lot, not Abraham's. It was Lot's hospitality that saved him, not Abraham's. This doesn't mean that Abraham is somehow unimportant in the Sodom story. We can actually learn a lot about this chapter. It's just that he isn't the focus of the story. Abraham's love, intercession, and hospitality may not have played a central role in the Sodom story, but it does tell us a lot about who Abraham was and how he understood God. His heart was after God's heart, and I think that's the real lesson of Genesis 18. Abraham had a heart for Sodom, and I think so did God. Abraham wanted to see people saved, so did God. Abraham reveals in that story how much like God he was. Now, the first challenge at the end of Thursday is to pray for our city. The deeper challenge is to find someone in a difficult situation and let them know that you're praying for them. These are pretty simple challenges. And if you're teaching, encourage your class to do it and include some time in case people want to give feedback on how it went. Well, thanks for watching Sabbath School Boot Camp with me this week. I'll see you next week. Class dismissed.